Cultural Revolution in China. The first was a campaign of cultural terror by the Red Guard, cultural and ideological terror. And then the Red Guards were dispersed out in these communes. And what happened is the Cultural Revolution sort of transitioned or spiraled into a political power play between upper Communist Party members, including those critical of Mao's Cultural Revolution and hardline tactics. Now, Mao's wife Jiang Qing and her Gang of Four controlled media at the time and railed against moderates. Mao was aging and dying, and his wife at this time was a contender for rule, which was a scary prospect. So, the Chinese by this time had lost trust in the government. And there are some party officials who are realizing we need to adjust our tactics to regain that. So when two of the more moderate members of the party, who, by the way, had been sent to re-education camps by Mao, but when one of them died, one of the two died, people rose in protest at Tiananmen Square. So on one hand, they're memorializing this more moderate political leader who had died. And on the other hand, they're also protesting and denouncing the Gang of Four and hardline Maoism. And that really sent a message that we need to start doing something different. So when Mao died in 1976, his hand-picked successor actually arrested the Gang of Four, including Mao's wife. So he knew what he was doing. His successor still sought to follow Maoism. He was just trying to get away from things like the Cultural Revolution. Now, he was eventually outmaneuvered by Deng Xiaoping, who was one of the moderates that I mentioned. And Deng was actually a pragmatic reformer. He never held the head of state position, but he was a leader of the Communist Party. He had a lot of power. His ideas were enacted. And he is responsible for economic reform and opening China up to the global economy and just creating a bit more openness in China in general. He probably advocated more for economic openness than political openness, but in relation to Mao or his wife, he was more moderate in those respects as well. Alright, so let's move on from the Cultural Revolution and talk about China and the Cold War. So remember that the U.S. would not recognize the Chinese communists in mainland China for decades. We supported Chiang Kai-shek as the true Chinese leader in Taiwan. Now, the Soviet Union at this time and China shared ideologies and treaties. They actually had an uneasy relationship in spite of the Soviet aid to China in the 50s. So the Soviets had sent economic and technical experts to China in an effort to help them come out of their problems. Ideologically, the Soviets and the Chinese communists were different. The Chinese communists valued the role of the peasantry in the revolution. The Soviets believed in a revolutionary elite of urban intellectuals and workers leading the country. Now, in 1959, border clashes occurred, and also ideological disputes that led the Soviets to withdraw aid and end the alliance. So both the Soviets and the and the Chinese remained communist countries, but they really didn't have a strong friendship at all. So how do you think the Western powers viewed this split? Because at this time now the Soviets are actually withdrawing aid. So there's a marked difference in that relationship. So let's just keep up with the 50s. You know that the Korean War happened fairly shortly after World War II, and Korea was one nation that eventually split into two as a result, one communist side, one democratic side. The U.S. and China supported the opposing sides, and at this point, U.S. policy was to try to isolate China to contain the threat of communism. However, at the end of the 50s, the China-Soviet rift was evident, and we saw a strategic opportunity to improve relations with China. In 1971, China won admission into the United Nations. This is a big deal. It can't really be overstated in a way because it's giving them legitimacy. Remember, the nationalist and the democratic government in Taiwan claimed to be the true leadership of China. So, Communist China winning admission into the United Nations was a statement. 1 year later, President Richard Nixon visited Mao in Beijing, and this historic 1972 visit helped clear the way for normalization of U.S. relations with Communist China. This also cannot be overstated. It was a drastic shift in foreign policy. It probably also went a long way in opening up China's economy as well. And I think defrosting this relationship probably gave both countries more ease of mind. So in 1979, formal diplomatic relations were assumed between U.S. and China. And now it's formalized. Alright, so let's just go back to Taiwan. Taiwan, under Chiang Kai-shek, had always hoped to regain mainland China, and Chiang Kai-shek actually exercised authoritarian rule in Taiwan. Mao saw Taiwan as a breakaway province and sought to reunite it with mainland China. Taiwan, after Chiang Kai-shek, actually transitioned into a democratic government, but officially few countries recognized Taiwan as an independent nation. So I think that's pretty evident with Communist China's admission into the UN. And Taiwan has still done well for itself. It's become an economic powerhouse and center for computer technology for decades. More recently, trade and other talks have grown between China and Taiwan in spite of disagreements with Taiwan's sovereignty. But it's always an uneasy relationship. So, for the obvious factors. So that's what's happening with Taiwan. So let's go back to Mao's death in 1976. And moderate leaders are emerging in China who sought to bring reform from within communism. So they don't want to oust communism. They want to refurbish it. And by 1981, Deng Xiaoping became the leader of China, kind of the de facto leader. He really leads the Communist Party. And he saw economic reform with the Four Modernization, a program designed to build science, defense, industry, and agriculture. Foreign capital and technology were welcomed, and joint ventures were arranged with Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the West. So this is very different from what Mao had in mind. Mao had a very insular economic program that led to famine. The other thing is that there are special enterprise zones under Deng's watch, and these were established for foreigners to own and operate industries within China. And for some of the Chinese, these reforms resulted with growth and a higher standard of living. But for others, crime, corruption, and inequality made life a little less desirable, so it really depended. Now, with new economic reforms, many Chinese called for political reform and greater personal freedom. And in fact, in May 1989, and I remember this, thousands of demonstrators occupied Tiananmen Square, raising banners calling for democracy and political freedom for the Chinese. And in response, the government sent in troops and tanks. And thousands of demonstrators were killed or wounded, and many others were arrested, tortured, or put to death. So this was a major statement to show that China's leaders were determined to maintain control and keep China communist. So comparative to Mao's time, it's more open, but only so far. So here's a little mini map of Tiananmen Square in 1989. This posits the number at 1 million pro-democracy protesters occupying Beijing Tiananmen Square. So that's a large number. And at first, Chinese leaders tolerated the demonstration. But as the protests grew louder and larger, they began to crack down. So that's when the tanks and the troops were sent in to crush the protesters. And you see a picture there of a death of a reformist Chinese political leaders. Here we see other pictures. Day 18, you see that students have erected a statue called the Goddess of Democracy, right by a big portrait of Mao Zedong. And the second picture, day 22, you see the Chinese soldiers moving into Tiananmen Square to force out the protesters. Hundreds were killed that day. And then on June 5th, this is a famous image from the events at Tiananmen Square. It's an unarmed man facing down a line of Chinese tanks. So, moving along, China was successful in becoming a major industrial power. There are still some unresolved issues plaguing the country, as we all have. One of the most challenging ones is overpopulation, and remember they had that whole famine issue. So it's really important not to become too overpopulated where you can't feed your citizens. Hungry citizens are angry citizens. So 1949, the population had doubled to more than 1.2 billion. That's the largest population at that time in the world. So what happened is a one-child per family policy was instituted to relieve the strain on the economy. And this policy did help with food scarcity. It was so effective after decades that the Chinese government is now trying to reverse the trend in favor of 2 children. And there's a few reasons worth researching if you're interested in why 2. So that's that. I'm going to get cut off, but it's worth noting that after Deng's death, China became the world's second largest economy after the USA. Now, of course, the booming economy that has a more diversified market also widened the gap between the rich and the poor, and there's a little bit more corruption as well. And although communist ideology has weakened, the party still tries to maintain political control as it loosens economic control. So some of the issues are a lack of free speech, or the use of prison labor, and oppression against Tibetans, etc.